It was a nice meeting in terms of the atmospherics, but a very disappointing meeting in terms of the substance.
A new tone in U.S. DPRK relations, a more constructive one.
Hundreds of steps that must be taken before denuclearization is complete.
The United States will stop military exercises with South Korea.
Very big mistake, both in negotiating terms, but also in terms of the impact on our alliance with South Korea.
But it's not something that we should be front-loading into this as a gift to the North Koreans.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello, I'm Eun-jung Cho at the Voice of America. Welcome to this special edition of Washington Talk. President Donald Trump is the first sitting U.S. president to meet with a North Korean leader. During their meeting in Singapore, Chairman Kim Jong-un signed an agreement reaffirming his commitment to complete denuclearization. What did the U.S. gain and give up in the Singapore summit? Now, my guest today, Mr. Thomas Countryman, Chairman of the Board of Directors for the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman was a Korea Foreign Service officer for 35 years and served as acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Also joining us today, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2005 and 2008 and was also Deputy Secretary General of NATO. I'm also joined by Mr. Frank Jannuzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to the program, all of you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Afternoon. Hi. The two leaders made a 4-point agreement on the new bilateral relationship, on the peace regime, and complete denuclearization, and POW remains returning them. So how would you put this agreement briefly in one sentence?
Well, I would say it was a nice meeting in terms of the atmospherics, but a very disappointing meeting in terms of the substance. There was absolutely no advance on denuclearization. In fact, it's weaker and more vague than previous agreements under previous administrations. And President Trump seems to have made a unilateral decision to suspend Korean-American military exercises, which is a serious blow to the ROK-U.S. alliance. So I definitely see a negative result when you look at the balance sheet.
I would say that so far neither side has gained anything of substance or given up anything of great substance. It's very positive that this result, this wonderful photo opportunity, delays any prospect of a military conflict in Asia, but the real hard work only begins now.
Well, I found the summit, on the one hand, to be a bit of a thin gruel. The substance was sorely lacking. On the other hand, when you're talking about achieving peace and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, you need to start with the right spirit and tone and high-level commitment. And I think the two leaders did establish a new tone in U.S. DPRK relations, a more constructive one. And they also agreed to keep talking. And this is going to be a long and difficult process.
And Mr. Jannuzi, what was achieved in terms of the most important goal of denuclearization?
Well, the only thing achieved toward that goal at the summit was to reiterate, but in very vague terms, North Korea's commitment to complete denuclearization. Missing from the joint statement is any specificity about things like the peaceful use of nuclear power. Can North Korea have peaceful space launch vehicles as distinct from ICBMs? And there's no timeline and no process yet associated with these commitments. I would have preferred to have seen an agreement that, for instance, might have established at a date certain the moment at which North Korea would suspend the production of fissile material, plutonium and uranium. That is not a part of this agreement yet. So there's enormous work to be done.
If any one of you can take this question, so even after the signed agreement, is it there's a big gap between North Korea and the United States in the concept of denuclearization?
I'm afraid there is, or at least there's no evidence that that gap has been closed. I think U.S. tried. They had all these frantic negotiations in the week leading up to the summit, with Sung Kim called out of retirement to, or out of his different job to do the negotiations. But the North Koreans gave absolutely nothing, as far as I can tell. And so all these questions are left unanswered, including what Kim Jong-un wants in return, because it's denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, not just of North Korea, which is not a new formulation, but nevertheless, we have to suspect that he wants to see some serious reductions in the U.S. presence, if not the withdrawal of all U.S. troops, perhaps removal of the nuclear umbrella. So I think we're starting really at square one, and I fear that the move on exercises actually squanders leverage that could be used in these very important follow-on negotiations that now will begin.
Well, it was only a few weeks ago that the Trump administration had rejected a freeze-for-freeze proposal, suspending North Korean production of fissile material in exchange for a freeze of U.S. military exercises. So it was passing strange to hear President Trump give up the joint exercises and essentially get nothing in return. That was an awkward and unusual development.
Really good. Awkward is a very nice word.
In talking about denuclearization, the statement was very similar to agreements that the U.S. and North Korea made 25 years ago in the Clinton administration. It's not surprising that there are different points of view between the U.S. and North Korea. And it's not surprising that Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim are not the right people to resolve that disagreement in a single day's meeting. But it does need to be the first priority for the follow-up meetings between diplomats of the two countries.
And I would say that the other aspects of the deal that is at least outlined, a peace regime for the Korean Peninsula and normalization of relations, need to be held as leverage for denuclearization, because otherwise we'll be giving Kim Jong-un everything he dreams of. International stature, de facto recognition as a nuclear weapon state, and giving up absolutely nothing in return, which turns the whole aim of this process on its head.
We just, Mr. Countryman, just compared with the past agreements, and since the past agreement in 2012 and 2005, North Korea's nuclear program has become more sophisticated. So how is it more difficult to denuclearize, dismantle, and verify?
North Korea has dozens of locations, hundreds of buildings, thousands of scientists, and you have to be able to address all of those and make sure that they are no longer employed for the production of weapons. So it's a years-long process.
So important to understand that this is about risk management. The process of denuclearization should proceed with the highest value, highest risk items to be addressed first. Plutonium production, fissile material production, ICBM testing, nuclear testing, but then as you proceed down the path, there are literally hundreds of facilities that need to be somehow either eliminated or transformed from military uses to peaceful. And this is going to take 6, 10 or more years.
That's absolutely right. And beyond the technical aspects, sort of the basic difference from past agreements is they have nuclear weapons. They have missiles. So what the Trump administration was trying to achieve, as far as we know, was what you could call a front-loaded schedule, where the most dangerous things, the bombs themselves, the warheads, and the intercontinental missiles that can reach the U.S. mainland and kind of jeopardize the balance of power, that those would be at least taken offline and maybe removed from the country or disabled. So we need to get back on that kind of path to put the North Koreans to the test. Because right now they've given nothing, either on the scope or the timing of this. There's nothing on verification.
So Ambassador Vershbow just mentioned about the weapons and the ICBMs. What other things should be put down on paper in the first follow-on discussions? What are the most important in denuclearization?
I'm not sure everything has to be put down on paper immediately. It's important to begin negotiating and narrowing the differences, but not necessarily just sign agreements until there's much more progress. One of the first things that North Korea could do would be to make a complete declaration of all of its nuclear material, facilities, weapons stockpile. That would be a significant step. It could also return to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it claims to have withdrawn from. It could ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would be an extremely important goodwill gesture.
Another important point, which was not in the signed agreement, but was that President Trump told the reporters that now the United States will stop military exercises with South Korea. So how do you see this in the perspective of give and take in negotiations?
Well, I mentioned this already. I think it was a very big mistake, both in negotiating terms, but also in terms of the impact on our alliance with South Korea. I know this from my time in Korea, but also as a veteran of NATO, that the key to an effective deterrent and defense capability is maintaining your forces at readiness so that they're able to go into action without any warning, and that they're interoperable with fellow allies. So U.S. only keeps its troops in Korea for 1 year at a time, and then they rotate. So you need exercises every year to have that high level of readiness. And this sends a very bad message that the president doesn't think this is important. And I think my friends in Europe are going to be worried about this too.
So to have the president of the United States adopt the North Korean verbiage describing our defensive exercises as a provocative threat was very surreal. I think that adjustments in the U.S. force posture and exercise posture are entirely appropriate down the road when we see progress in denuclearization, when we see changes maybe in the North Korean force posture and their exercise posture. But it's not something that we should be front-loading into this as a gift to the North Koreans. It should be something that we hold as a bargaining chip for real progress.
Yeah, the North-South Summit Declaration spoke of balanced force reductions of conventional forces by the two Koreas. That should be well advanced, and then perhaps the U.S. troop level could be reduced as well.
Yes.
South Koreans seemed blindsided by the announcement by President Trump, and the reaction from South Korean President Moon Jae-in was that the Sentosa agreement was a historical one, and that he didn't make any mention about the stopping of the military exercises. So how should we interpret this reaction from South Korea?
It concerns me. We can only succeed in this very long process of negotiation with North Korea if we have the tightest possible coordination among the U.S., South Korea, and Japan as well. And for the president to surprise Seoul in this manner is bothersome. I don't think it's fatal. I think that we can catch up on this kind of coordination, but it was not a happy sign.
Yeah. And reportedly, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, didn't know about it either. So that's not encouraging as well.
What was also missed out from the agreement was any mention of human rights. Of course, President Trump said that he did discuss this with Chairman Kim Jong-un. So is this a missed opportunity on the U.S. side, or is it better to discuss human rights later on in the negotiations?
Well, look, as someone who used to work on this for Amnesty International, I was glad that the president said that he raised human rights issues with Kim Jong-un. I also think that there's no situation on the peninsula that is more conducive to improving human rights than a situation of peace. So the objective of peace and denuclearization should not be held hostage to North Korea's horrendous human rights record. What is lacking again is either a roadmap or a game plan for how we are going to integrate our concern about North Korea's human rights situation into the process of normalization of relations.
Well, China was very quick to react to the summit. Right after the summit, China made an announcement that UN Security Council should ease sanctions on North Korea. So do you think China had planned on making this announcement and just waited for that moment for the summit to close?
I'm suspicious that that's the case, and I'm sure the Russians won't be far behind in suggesting sanctions relief. So there, I'm pleased that President Trump and everybody on the U.S. delegation is reaffirming that there will be no sanctions relief until there's some concrete results on denuclearization. I mean, we may not need to wait till the very end. I mean, if the North Koreans really demonstrate their seriousness, they prove that my skepticism is wrong, they start chopping up a few missiles and show us that this is different, then maybe we can do a gradual relief of sanctions. But it's far too early for that. The Chinese, I think, shouldn't be surprised at getting slapped down by the United States on this.
Well, I agree with that. And the United States should not consider changing the Security Council resolutions until North Korea has actually taken concrete steps. The problem with the Chinese statement is that the Chinese always say we are implementing Security Council resolutions. And they say that when they really are implementing the resolutions, but they also say that when they simply look the other way and ignore the violations. What I'm afraid will happen is that China will now stop the serious implementation of sanctions that it has pursued for the last year, and that will, in effect, release the pressure on the North Korean regime and release it prematurely.
I think this question goes to Frank, and the returning of the remains of the POW was in the 4-point agreement. So was this that high on the priority for the United States?
Well, you know, I was so pleased to see that issue mentioned. I was stunned that it was the only specific confidence and security building humanitarian item of any specificity in the agreement. When I visited for the first time North Korea in 2001, I had the privilege to go and see a site where U.S. soldiers were preparing to dig for the remains of their comrades left behind in the war. This operation, this joint operation with the Korean People's Army, provides meaningful security assurances to the North Koreans, because while our troops are on the ground, we're not going to do anything. And it also is a great opportunity for the U.S. military to forge connections to the Korean People's Army, which, after all, is in charge of these nuclear missiles and the like. So I think it's a great thing to include, but it's clearly not a strategic issue between the two countries. It's a humanitarian issue, one of great importance to American families. But the fact that they included it, to me, suggests that they were desperate to put something in the agreement that was specific, and this was the only one they could come up with.
I'd like to ask any one of you, so what is the importance of the follow-on negotiations from now on? What should be done?
Well, the follow-on negotiations become the main event now. This was kind of a preliminary, and the positive atmosphere at least gives us a sort of sense of hope that this process could move forward. But the nitty-gritty of denuclearization was really not advanced by the summit. So Pompeo and the experts that he's going to organize now have a very steep hill to climb in order to actually get some concrete results and put the North Koreans to the test. Pompeo clearly is on top of this brief. He's already met twice with Kim Jong-un, even before this summit. So hopefully we can rectify some of the mistakes or missed opportunities in this summit when we get into the serious negotiations. We shouldn't set any artificial deadlines for ourselves. Another visit, another summit, having Kim Jong-un come to Washington, I think should be held in abeyance until we can see whether this is the same old Kim dynasty at work, or whether the Kim Jong-un is really different from his father and his grandfather.
I agree that the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, is in the driver's seat now, and that's appropriate. It can't be the president to get into these level of details. It shouldn't be the National Security Advisor, John Bolton. The real question is whether Mr. Pompeo will do something that so far the White House has not done in a year and a half, which is to trust the professional diplomats and scientists and analysts who can actually create the conditions to meet the goals set out in the communique.
Yeah, my crystal ball is always a little bit foggy on North Korea, but I'm very glad that Pompeo seems to be driving this process forward now. And I would not be surprised, however, in light of his personal commitment to the pageantry of this process, if President Trump did not plan a visit to Pyongyang before November. I worry because already the president has essentially bestowed great legitimacy and prestige and honor onto the North Korean leader. And a visit to Pyongyang would be sort of the final icing on the cake. And this is something that should be viewed as a diplomatic tool, not as a ratings-driven TV event.
Well, on that note, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us again later this week for our regular programming.